The autumn afternoon had stained the sky copper when Damien Hartley arrived at the rural property. Leaves danced in whirlwinds along the stone path, and the air carried that damp chill that foretold storms. He found Isabella by the drawing room window, her profile cut against the dim light, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the fogged glass. Damien paused at the entrance, watching her. 6 months had passed since he'd first seen her, and still she could steal his breath with the same ease as that night at the ball. But something had changed. For weeks he'd felt it. A subtle distance, a silence that hadn't existed before. Isabella. His voice came out lower than intended. She turned, and for a moment their eyes met. Deep brown, always so expressive, now holding something he couldn't decipher. A secret. Or perhaps a goodbye. Damien. His name on her lips used to sound like a promise. Today it sounded like farewell. He crossed the room, his steps muffled by the Persian rug. When he came close enough to touch her, he extended his hand, his fingers grazing her arm. Isabella shuddered, but didn't lean into him as she had before. Didn't melt beneath his touch. "Is everything all right?" Damien asked, though he knew it wasn't. Yes. The lie hung between them, transparent as a bride's veil. Isabella turned back to the window, and Damien felt something contract in his chest. He was losing her. Somehow, without understanding how or why, he was losing the only real thing in his life of pretenses. The wind howled against the window panes. On the horizon, dark clouds gathered like omens. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you also love stories full of secrets, passion, and redemption? Your comment and like really help this channel grow and show that you want to see more stories like this. And if you're not yet a subscriber, subscribe now and activate the bell so you don't miss the next story in the Countess Tales. Now, let's get back to the story, because what happens next will take your breath away. Chapter 2. The First Encounter. 6 months earlier. The Pembroke residence ballroom teemed with the brilliance of 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers. Damien Hartley, Viscount of Thornley, circulated among the crowd with the ease of one born to it. Precise greetings, measured smiles, each gesture rehearsed since childhood. At 31, he knew this game better than most. He saw her by chance, or perhaps by fate. Isabella stood at the margins of the ballroom, not hidden, but strategically invisible. Dark blue silk dress, without the extravagant jewels other women flaunted. Lady Pembroke's companion, someone had informed him. A young woman of modest origins whom the hostess had taken under her protection. Pretty, but without title. Present by courtesy, not by right. There was something in her posture, upright but not rigid, attentive but not anxious, that captured Damien's attention. She observed the ballroom like one studying a battlefield, her eyes scanning faces and conversations with sharp intelligence. When their eyes met for the first time, Damien felt the impact like a blow. She didn't look away, didn't blush, simply studied him with the same intensity with which he studied her, until the corners of her lips curved into a half-smile that was more challenge than invitation. Damien crossed the ballroom before he could think better of it. "May I have the honor of this dance?" Isabella tilted her head, assessing him. Can a viscount dance with a woman without title and not tarnish his reputation? My reputation is already tarnished enough. The answer came out more honest than it should have. She accepted his hand. And when the waltz began, and he pulled her closer than was strictly appropriate, Isabella didn't pull away. Their bodies moved in perfect synchrony, as if they'd danced together 1,000 times before. "What is a woman like you doing in a place like this?" Damien whispered near her ear. "The same as you, I imagine." Her voice had the texture of velvet over steel. Pretending to belong. Something within him recognized something within her. Loneliness calling to loneliness through the golden, empty halls of aristocracy. When the music ended, Damien held her hand a second longer than necessary. Isabella noticed. Of course she noticed. But she said nothing, merely slid her fingers from his grasp with deliberate slowness. "Good night, Viscount." She disappeared into the crowd, leaving only the scent of jasmine and the certainty that Damien Hartley had just found his obsession. Chapter 3: The Obsessive Courtship. The white roses arrived the next morning. 24 of them, perfect as newly fallen snow, accompanied by a card with only one line: "For the woman who dances as if she knew all my secrets." Isabella should have refused. She knew the rules of this game. A viscount didn't court a woman without title with honorable intentions. But there was something in his audacity, in the way those flowers filled her modest rented room with fragrance and beauty, that made her hesitate. The gifts continued. A book of French poetry, pages marked with verses about unrequited desire, a sapphire brooch she could never wear in public, invitations for discreet walks in distant parks, where no indiscreet gaze would reach them. Isabella resisted for 3 weeks, responded with polite refusals, with eloquent silences. But Damien was persistent in a way that bordered on devotion. He didn't send messengers, he appeared personally, rain or shine, always with that look promising world she knew to be lies. "Why me?" Isabella finally asked, on an afternoon when he'd found her feeding pigeons in the park. "London is full of women more beautiful, younger, more appropriate." Damien remained silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice carried something that sounded dangerously close to truth. "Because you look at me as if you can see through me. And don't run from what you see." The raw honesty of it disarmed her. Isabella knew hunger when she saw it. Not for food or wealth, but for real connection in a world of masks. She felt the same hunger herself, though she'd learned to hide it better. On the night she finally yielded, London rained. Damien appeared soaked at her door, without carriage, without servants, just him and the storm. He said nothing, didn't need to. Isabella opened the door wider than necessary, a silent invitation. When he entered, bringing the smell of rain and something more indefinable, perhaps hope, perhaps despair, she knew she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Damien kissed her with the urgency of a man who finally finds water after days in the desert. And Isabella, who had sworn never again to let anyone touch her after the humiliation of so many social rejections, allowed herself to be touched. That night, while the storm shook the windows, they became lovers. And Isabella, against all logic and experience, began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this could be different. Chapter 4: The Golden Months. The months that followed were the happiest of Isabella's life, though she knew she shouldn't call them that. They met in discreet houses far from aristocratic eyes. Damien rented small rural properties under false names, places where they could exist without titles or expectations. There, he wasn't the Viscount of Thornley, heir to vast lands and ancient obligations. He was just Damien, the man who laughed when she teased him about his aristocratic tastes, who read poetry aloud while she embroidered, who slept with his head in her lap as if he could finally lower his guard. "Tell me about your childhood," he asked one golden afternoon, the two of them lying in a field of wildflowers. Isabella hesitated. Her past was dangerous territory, full of landmines that could explode the fantasy they'd built. But something in his gaze, genuine curiosity, not just courtesy, made her risk it. "I grew up in the countryside, alone for the most part." Half-truths. "And you?" "Surrounded by people, but always alone." Damien traced invisible patterns on her palm. "My mother died when I was 8. My father became a statue after that, physically present, absent in everything else. I was raised by tutors who taught me to be a viscount, but never taught me to be human." The vulnerability in that disarmed her. Isabella intertwined her fingers with his, the only comfort she could offer. There were moments, fleeting, dangerous, where she forgot what they really were, where she allowed herself to imagine waking every morning beside him, walking through the corridors of a great house not as a shadow, but as its mistress. Moments where she almost believed he could love her, almost. Reality always returned at nightfall, when he needed to leave to maintain appearances in London. when she remained alone in the empty bed, reminding herself that women like her didn't receive happy endings. They received only golden intervals between storms. It was one such morning, alone, that Isabella felt the first nausea. Her body knew before her mind wanted to accept. Her hands trembled when she placed them on her still flat belly. She knew the signs. The golden world suddenly seemed like a closing cage. Isabella sat on the bed, breath short, panic rising in her throat like tide. She was carrying a Viscount's child, the child of a man who could never call her wife. A secret, another secret to carry, as she herself had been. Chapter 5. The Body Doesn't Lie. Isabella hid the pregnancy with the skill of one who'd learned early to hide inconvenient truths. Dresses with looser cuts, polite refusals for dinners where the smell of food sickened her, creative excuses for moments when exhaustion overtook her without warning. Damien noticed her growing distance, but attributed it to other causes. Perhaps she was tiring of him. Perhaps she'd found someone more suitable. The insecurity he hid so well began to crack his facade. "Are you well?" he asked, increasingly frequent. "Just tired," she lied, and the lie hurt more with each repetition. 3 weeks passed. Isabella's body changed in ways that soon couldn't be hidden. She needed to decide, needed to act. But how to ask for the impossible? How to demand what no mistress had the right to demand? On a sleepless night, Isabella rose and went to the small study. By candlelight, she wrote and rewrote letters she'd never send. Words that oscillated between plea and demand, between love and despair. "Damien, I'm carrying your child. I need you to..." She crumpled the paper, began again. "Viscount of Thornley, circumstances force me to..." Another crumpled paper, another false start. The truth was simple and impossible at once. She didn't want to be kept as a secret. Didn't want her child to grow up as she had, on the margins, invisible, a footnote in someone else's story. But how to ask for legitimacy from a man who couldn't offer it? Chapter 6. The Weight of the Past. 26 years earlier, Isabella was 5 when she understood she was different. Not because anyone had explained. Children don't receive gentle explanations about bastardy. But because she saw her father from afar, the earl who visited the property where her mother worked as governess, and he never looked directly at her. Her legitimate half-siblings played in the main gardens, in fine clothes with tutors. Isabella stayed in the back, in patched dresses and heavy silences. Her mother died when she was 12. Fever that could have been treated if they'd had money for better doctors. The earl arranged a discreet funeral and an even more discreet solution for the problem Isabella represented. She was sent to live with a distant aunt in London, a bitter woman who accepted her only for the money the earl sent monthly. Isabella grew up there, at society's margins, too poor to belong, too pretty to be ignored, too bastard to be accepted. At 18, the aunt died, and the earl's money ceased. Isabella was left alone, without family, without resources, without position. She survived as companion to elderly ladies, invisible in ballrooms where she'd once dreamed of belonging. For years, she observed from afar, saw young ladies marry well, have legitimate children, live lives that seemed simple only because they were born with the right name. She herself had never been honestly courted, only pursued by men who saw in her an easy conquest, a woman without protection. Isabella had learned early, women like her didn't receive rings. They received indecent proposals whispered in dark corridors. Until she met Lady Pembroke, an eccentric widow who hired her as companion and, surprisingly, treated her with genuine kindness. It was Lady Pembroke who'd taken her to the ball where Damien had first seen her, and now, at 31, Isabella was pregnant with a Viscount's child. History was repeating itself, but this time Isabella had a choice. She wouldn't allow her child to be another shameful secret, wouldn't allow it to grow up invisible, questioning its own right to exist, even if it meant losing Damien, especially if it meant losing Damien. Because some things were more important than love. Some things were more important than stolen happiness in discreet houses. Dignity, for instance. Legitimacy. The right to exist fully under the sun. Isabella placed her hand on her belly, feeling the life growing there. Small, vulnerable, dependent on her choices. "You will have a name," she whispered to the unborn child. "I promise, even if it cost her everything." Chapter 7. The storm approaches. Isabella sent the message on a gray Thursday. Few words, written with steady hand despite her racing heart. "I need to see you. It's urgent. Come to the rural property tomorrow at nightfall." Damien arrived before the appointed time, his features marked by worry. He found her in the drawing room, by the window, watching dark clouds gather on the horizon. "Isabella!" He crossed the room quickly, hands reaching for her. "What happened? Are you all right?" "I am." She allowed herself to sink into his embrace for a moment. Just a moment, before pulling away gently. She needed distance for what came next, needed clarity. Damien frowned, his eyes scanning her face as if seeking answers she hadn't yet given. "Then why?" "We need to talk." The words came out firmer than she felt. "About us. About the future." Something in her tone made him go still. Isabella saw the exact moment fear took hold. Fear of being dismissed. Fear of losing the only real refuge he'd known. "You're ending this," he said, and it wasn't a question. "No." Isabella turned completely to face him. "But I need you to tell me the truth, Damien. The complete truth without protections or niceties. About us. About what this really is. I love you." The words burst from him with desperate urgency, as if saying them fast enough could make them powerful enough. Isabella felt something break and rebuild simultaneously inside her chest. "Love enough for what?" she asked gently, cruelly. "To keep me hidden? To visit when convenient? For everything?" He reached for her again, hands gripping her shoulders. "For anything you need? Even marriage?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Isabella saw pain cross his face, saw understanding arriving like a storm. "Isabella, it's just a question, Damien." Her voice remained calm, though her heart was breaking. Hypothetical, but they both knew it wasn't. And when thunder began to roll across the landscape, Isabella knew it was time. Time to demand the impossible. Time to discover if love was enough to break chains forged by birth. Chapter 8. The Impossible Request. The storm broke with biblical fury. Rain lashed the windows like 1,000 fingers knocking, demanding entry. Lightning tore through the sky, transforming the world into snapshots of light and shadow. Isabella stood before the fireplace, flames reflecting in her eyes like promise or threat. Damien was on the other side of the room, the distance between them seeming insurmountable. "I'm pregnant." 2 words. World-changing. Damien froze, his face passing through 1,000 emotions in seconds. Shock, joy, fear, panic. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "About 2 months," Isabella continued, voice steady despite the internal tremor. "Perhaps 9 weeks. It doesn't show yet, but soon." "Isabella!" His voice came out hoarse, broken. He took a step toward her, hands extended. We? "No." She raised her hand, stopping him. Not yet. She needed to say everything before courage abandoned her. "Let me finish." Damien nodded, mute, waiting. "I know what you'll offer," Isabella said. "A discreet house, generous allowance, education for the child, perhaps even occasional visits when your schedule permits. Everything in shadows, everything in secret. I would care for you both." The words burst from him with desperate intensity. "I'd give everything except your name." The silence that followed was deafening, filling the room like a living entity. Isabella met his eyes across the distance and the storm. "I need your name, Damien, not as your mistress, as your wife." Each word cost, but she said them all. "I need legitimacy. I need this child to have what I never had, the right to exist fully, without shame, without being hidden like a mistake that needs correcting." Damien closed his eyes as if the pain were too physical to bear. When he opened them again, there was something dead in them. "You know I can't." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Isabella, you know." "I know." She wanted to sound strong, but her voice came out broken. "I know you're promised. I know there are contracts, properties, expectations. I know asking this is asking the impossible." "Then why?" Despair now, raw and open. "Why ask for something that will destroy everything between us?" "Because I won't be kept as a secret." The words came out with strength she didn't know she had. "Because my child won't grow up questioning its right to exist. Because I deserve more than crumbs of love hidden in discreet properties." Thunder shook the house. Isabella saw Damien crumble, saw the exact moment he understood the impossibility of the choice before him. "I love you," he said again, and this time it sounded like an epitaph. "I know." And that was the tragedy. But love isn't enough when the whole world conspires against us. Chapter 9. His Truth. Damien approached the window, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders curved under invisible weight. When he spoke, his voice carried decades of resignation. "Lady Vivian Montrose, daughter of the Duke of Claridge." The words came out mechanical, rehearsed. "I was promised to her when we were 9. She was 10. We didn't even know each other." Isabella listened in silence, each word a blade. "My father had contracted enormous debts. Gambling, bad investments. The Thornley estate was months from being lost." Damien pressed his forehead against the cold glass. "The Duke offered salvation. £50,000 in exchange for a betrothal. My freedom for the family name. 22 years ago. And here we are." "Do you love her?" Isabella needed to know, though the answer wouldn't change anything. "I never loved her. I barely know her." He turned, eyes finding hers across the room. "We see each other twice a year? Talk about weather and politics. She's kind, polite, perfectly appropriate, and absolutely a stranger to me. Then end it." Brutal simplicity. "It's not that simple." Damien ran his hands through his hair, frustration breaking aristocratic composure. "The Duke invested another $50,000 in property renovations, properties that now generate income supporting 50 tenant families. If I break the betrothal, he'll demand everything back. Thornley will be lost. The families will be homeless. And me?" Isabella's voice remained calm, but there was steel in it. "Your child and I go without a name? I would care for you both." He crossed the room, hands reaching for her. "Isabella, I would swear under any sky that you'd have everything you needed. House, money, protection. Everything except truth." She moved away from his touch, not from anger, but from need for clarity. "You'd keep us as a shameful secret, as a mistake to be hidden." "It's not like that." Despair tore at his voice. "You would never be a mistake. Never." "But I'd be invisible." Isabella met his eyes. "Damien, I was a bastard child. I grew up hidden at the back of the property where my mother worked, seeing my father from afar, forbidden to call him that. I lived 31 years as a secret that needed hiding. I was sent to London at 12, after my mother's death, to live with an aunt who despised me. I survived as a companion, invisible in ballrooms where I'd never be accepted." She placed her hand on her belly. "I won't do that to my child. Won't condemn it to grow up invisible, questioning its own right to exist. No matter how much love you feel, no matter how much money you offer, some things are priceless." Damien sank into a chair, face in his hands. When he raised his head, there were unshed tears in his eyes. "You're asking me to choose between you and everything I am, between love and duty, between what I want and what I must do. No." Isabella knelt before him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I'm asking you to choose who you want to be. The Viscount who lives for others' approval, or the man who finally makes his own decisions." Silence. Long. Heavy. The storm began to wane outside, but inside the room, chaos was only beginning. "I need time," Damien finally whispered. "Then go." Isabella stood, dignified despite the tears threatening to fall. Go think. But know this, I won't accept being kept in shadows. If you can't give me your name, then I need you to let me go completely, so I can find another life, another way to protect my child, our child. Only if you claim it. Cruelly, necessarily. Otherwise, it will be only mine. Damien rose, his entire body trembling. He reached for her one last time, fingers grazing her face with devastating tenderness. I love you, he said once more. I know. Isabella closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel his touch one last time. But sometimes love isn't enough. Damien left at dawn, rain still falling in cold drops. Isabella watched him go from the window, watched the carriage disappear into darkness, and finally allowed the tears to fall. Chapter 10. 3 days of hell. Damien didn't sleep for 3 days. His London mansion, normally immaculate, had become a mausoleum of unmade decisions. He walked the corridors at night, passing portraits of ancestors who seemed to judge him. Thornleys of 10 generations, all fulfilling their duty, all sacrificing personal desires for the good of the lineage. On the first day, he tried to find practical solutions, sought lawyers, studied contracts. Was there any way to break the betrothal without financial ruin? Some obscure clause he could invoke? The answer was always no. On the second day, he visited the rural property, walked among the tenants' houses, saw the families who depended on Thornley's income. 50 families, 200 people, all trusting him to protect them. If he broke the betrothal, the Duke would demand his investment back. Thornley would be sold. The families would be evicted. On the third day, Damien stayed in his study, looking at his mother's portrait. She died when he was 8, but he still remembered the sadness in her eyes. His father had never loved her. It had been an arranged marriage, duty fulfilled. She'd lived and died unhappy, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. Damien touched her painted face. "What do I do?" he whispered. The portrait didn't answer, but something within him began to change. A slow, painful, inevitable understanding. He could choose his father's path: duty, property, appearances. Marry Lady Vivian, keep Isabella secret, live an entire life of lies and emptiness. Preserve Thornley, preserve 50 families, but lose his soul in the process. Or he could choose differently. Could, for the first time in his life, choose something for himself. Choose truth over lies, love over duty, freedom over golden chains, and accept all consequences. Damien looked out the window. The sun was rising, painting London gold and rose. A new day, a new choice. For the first time in 3 days, he knew what to do. Chapter 11. The Decision. The Duke of Claridge's study smelled of expensive cigars and ancient power. Damien sat before the massive mahogany desk, the final betrothal documents spread before him. 22 years of waiting culminating in this moment. Finally, the Duke said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a closed deal. Vivienne is eager to set a date. Next spring, I thought, something grand in the cathedral. Damien looked at the papers. His name, written in black ink, dotted line awaiting signature. So simple. Just pick up the pen, sign, and everything would be resolved. Thornley would be safe, the tenants protected, the Duke satisfied, and Isabella would disappear, taking with her the only piece of truth in his life of elaborate lies. Viscount? The Duke pushed the pen toward him. Something wrong? Damien picked up the pen. His fingers closed around it. For a moment he almost signed, almost chose the easier path. Then he saw Isabella in his mind. Not the Isabella of secret meetings, but the Isabella of that last night, standing before him, dignified in her despair, demanding what every person should have: the right to exist fully, the right not to be a secret. He saw the child that would come, a child who would grow up questioning its place in the world as Isabella had, or a child who would know without shadow of doubt that it was loved, chosen, recognized. Damien thought of his mother, of all the women trapped in loveless marriages because of duty and property, Of all the bastard children hidden on rural properties, invisible. He thought of the man he'd always been, obedient, appropriate, living for others' approval since he was 9 years old, and of the man he could choose to be. The pen slipped from his fingers, falling onto the desk with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire room. "I cannot sign." The silence was absolute. The Duke remained motionless, as if he hadn't understood the words. "Pardon? I cannot sign these documents." Damien stood, voice firm despite his racing heart. "I cannot marry Lady Vivian." The Duke's face passed through several shades of red. "You're joking." "No. 22 years." The Duke's voice rose, echoing off the book-lined walls. 22 years of waiting, 100,000 pounds invested in your properties, my daughter prepared to be your wife since childhood, and you dare. "I know." Damien didn't flinch. "And I'll repay every pound, even if it takes the rest of my life. Sell Thornley if necessary. Take everything, but I cannot do this." "Why?" The Duke rose, hands slamming on the desk. "Give me one reason, one single reason for this insanity." Damien met his eyes. "Because I've learned there are things more important than properties. More important than alliances. Even more important than 50 tenant families." His voice didn't waver. "There's truth. There's freedom. And there's love." "Love?" The Duke spat the word like an obscenity. "You're destroying your future for love?" "I'm building a real future." For the first time, Damien felt something like peace. "For the first time in my life, I'm choosing something for myself. Not for the Thornley name, not for society's approval. For me. You will be ruined." Threat now, cold and clear. "I'll see to it. No club will accept you. No respectable family will speak to you. Your reputation will be destroyed. So be it." Damien walked toward the door. "I'd rather be ruined and free than respected and imprisoned." He left the study without looking back. In London streets, the sun shone through clouds, and Damien Hartley, Viscount of Thornley, at 31 years old, for the first time in his life, felt truly free. Chapter 12. After the Storm. The scandal exploded through London like fire in dry straw. Viscount of Thornley breaks betrothal of 22 years. Duke of Claridge demands 100,000 pounds. Properties to be lost. Ruin imminent. The sharp tongues of high society worked with brutal efficiency. Within days, Damien was expelled from his clubs. Invitations were withdrawn. Doors closed. The society that had raised him turned its back with impressive speed. The Duke moved for legal action. Thornley was put up for sale to cover debts. Tenant families would receive 6 months to find new homes. Damien watched his world crumble with surprising quietude. Each letter of repudiation, each closed door, each malicious whisper, none of it mattered, because he knew where he was going. The morning after the scandal, Damien mounted his horse and left London. Not for Thornley Manor, which would soon belong to another. For the small rural property where he'd left Isabella. The journey took 6 hours. Time enough for doubt, for regret. But when he saw the house appear on the horizon, all he felt was relief. Isabella was in the garden. Simple dress, hair loose, hand on her slightly rounded belly. When she saw Damien at the gate, she froze. He dismounted slowly, crossed the garden without hurry, and when they stood face to face, he saw in her eyes the same question she didn't dare ask. "I broke the betrothal," Damien said simply. "I'll lose Thornley. Perhaps everything else. The scandal is—" He laughed without humor. "Considerable." Isabella said nothing, eyes searching his face. "I don't bring properties. I don't bring the financial security I once knew." Damien took her hands, intertwining their fingers. "But I bring my name, my truth, and the promise that you and our child will never be a secret." A tear ran down her face, then another. "You lost everything," she whispered. "I gained everything." He brought her hands to his lips. "For the first time, I have something real. Something I chose, not something that was chosen for me. Society. To hell with society." For the first time in weeks, Damien smiled, genuine, free. We'll build our own life. Perhaps in the countryside, far from prying eyes, perhaps even abroad. But together, in the open, without shame. Isabella studied his face for a long moment, searching for regret, finding only peace. "Marry me," Damien asked. Not an order, not a demand, just a simple, honest request. "Be my wife." Not in shadows, but under the sun. Her answer came as a kiss, as an embrace that broke the last barrier between them, as a yes whispered against his lips. They married 2 weeks later in a small rural church, without fanfare or aristocratic guests. Just the vicar, 2 local witnesses, and the truth between them. Isabella Hartley, Viscountess of Thornley. A title that would soon have no properties associated with it, but had something more valuable: choice, freedom. Love born not of duty, but of the courage to break chains. 4 months later, on a clear spring morning when their son was born, small, perfect, without shadow of shame or doubt, Damien held the child and finally understood. He'd lost nothing. He'd gained everything. Because some things are priceless, and the greatest of these is the right to exist fully, without lies, without masks, just truth, just love, just life lived in the open. And that, Damien learned late but completely, was worth more than any property or approval. Worth everything.